Welcome to the Nature of Inquiry. I'm Kathy Mazak, your instructor. There are three main ways of knowing that are important to understand when we're talking about research methods. One is knowing through our own experience, one is knowing through reasoning, and one is knowing through research. By the end of this video, you'll know at least a working definition for research and how it's different from experience and reasoning. Knowledge through personal experience comes from common sense knowing. Often our theories of how we know things are based on haphazard events, right? They're based on the things that we learn by living in the world. These ways of knowing are often uncritical, and maybe you're testing some theories, but very selectively. The treatment of evidence is not systematic. So, for example, if you use the example of a science fair at school, maybe you could say that all of my successful science fair students went on to study college, and that's because they were good at the science fair. That's what got them into college. So there's not, in that statement, that's kind of like a fallacy, right? Because there might be many, many, many other factors besides just the science fair that get students into college. Another example are kind of common sense things that people say, and you hear this all the time. They're different across cultures. But a great example is like, bad things happen in threes. So this is a common phrase in English, and maybe we kind of have heard this before, so that when two bad things happen to us, like for example, maybe you get a flat tire at the same day that you get a rejection notice for a job that you applied for, and you're thinking, oh, there's just one more thing is going to happen because bad things happen in threes. Now, when that third bad thing does happen, it confirms this idea, but it's not because we really were doing rigorous testing of the idea, but rather we had an expectation for what was going to happen, and then so when it happened, it just kind of supports our theory. Now there's many, many other times in your life where only one or two bad things happen, and you don't take that as a way of disproving that bad things happen in threes. So that's the difference between personal experience and research. Now, knowing something by reasoning, there's a long history of this kind of work. We have Aristotle and deductive reasoning. All planets orbit the sun, for example, and he uses a series of top-down deductions that go from general to specific to come to this conclusion. Then you have inductive reasoning, that's Bacon. So you have cases that then help you develop a hypothesis that lead to a generalization. This is bottom up and goes from specific to general. And then you also have combined inductive and deductive approaches. So that's a back and forth process of induction, which is observation to hypothesis, and deduction, which is hypothesis to implications. All of these things are perfectly reasonable ways to make knowledge about something, but this is not research. Scientific research develops theories systematically. There is a hypothesis and then empirical testing. And by empirical, what we mean is data that's observable, that we can actually see, something we could measure, we can count, we can observe. Often there's a control group and an experimental group, and relationships between variables are proven through rigorous experimentation. So an example is Mendel's pea plant experiment. So in Mendel's pea plant experiment, he looked at observed characteristics that seem to be inherited from one generation to the next of pea plants, for example, the pod color. And he designed a series of controlled experiments to cross-pollinate plants with different characteristics. And he came up with this Punnett square showing these different gene combinations in the F2 generation. So B is the dominant gene, which is green, and little b is the recessive gene, which is yellow. And by doing many controlled experiments with cross-pollination, he was able to prove his hypothesis about how pod color was formed. So the definition of research, or at least a working definition of research, we can use the Kurlinger 1970 to say that research is the systematic, controlled, empirical, and critical investigation of hypothetical propositions about the presumed relations among natural phenomena. Some distinguishing characteristics of research is that it's systematic and controlled, that it's empirical, in other words, based on data, based on evidence that we can observe, and it's self-correcting. The more research we do, the closer we get to provable conclusions. Now, in educational research and in language research, we have two traditions that have developed. We have a traditional way of doing research with experimental with control groups, often quantitative. And this type of research is concerned with making generalizations about what is true. And then we have research in the interpretive tradition, which tends to be more qualitative. It's based on thick description of phenomenon. Often case studies are used in this type of research, and it's very situated within context. The concern with interpretive research is with understanding the particulars in order to inform theory and discover what is true. Some key terms that you should know. Ontology. Okay, ontology asks the question, is social reality external to individuals, or is it a product of individual consciousness? If the tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? Okay, so that's the question that ontology asks. So if you believe that if the tree falls, it doesn't make a sound because there's no one to hear it, that kind of says something about what you believe about social reality, that reality is constructed socially. And if you believe that a tree falls and it makes a sound no matter what, whether somebody's there to hear it or not, then that's kind of a different kind of belief about objective reality. The movie The Matrix plays with this idea a lot. Epistemology answers the question, or asks the question, what is knowledge and how do we learn? So a positivist approach talks about knowledge as hard, objective, and tangible, and an anti or post-positivist stance looks at knowledge as personal, subjective, and unique. And to kind of give you an idea of some key terms and how they relate to each other, a subjectivist approach on the left, an objectivist approach on the right. For ontology, a subjectivist approach looks at nominalism. Objectivist approach would be called realism. In epistemology, we have anti-positivism versus positivism. In human nature, we have voluntarism versus determinism, and in methodology, we have ideographic versus nomothetic. Now, who cares about all of this? Why is it important, if you're taking a research class, to understand these big words and the nature of knowledge? Well, we need to understand how people view the world, what they understand is true, how they use evidence, what they believe is the nature of knowledge, in order to understand published research and to create our own.